The microphone screeched with feedback as David adjusted it at the podium, his marketing executive award gleaming under the Phoenix Convention Center's harsh stage lights. From my table in the back, I watched my husband of 4 years bask in the applause. His chest puffed with pride as he prepared to deliver his acceptance speech for Marketing Executive of the Year. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. I couldn't have achieved this without the support of my wonderful wife, Jessica, he said, gesturing vaguely in my direction. A few heads turned toward me, and I managed what I hoped was an appropriately grateful smile. She keeps our home running smoothly while I focus on building my career. She's just a simple housewife, but she understands the sacrifices required for success. The words hit like a slap across my face, though I kept my expression neutral. Around me, the audience of Phoenix's business elite nodded approvingly at this picture of traditional domestic support. If only they knew that the simple housewife they were looking at had spent that morning closing a $2 million consulting contract with a Fortune 500 company, or that the jewelry business David thought was my adorable little hobby was actually a carefully constructed cover for Nova Strategic Consulting, the firm I'd built from nothing into one of Arizona's most sought-after business strategy companies. But David didn't know any of that. To him, I was Jessica Martinez-Chen, the woman who sometimes burned dinner and forgot to pick up his dry cleaning, who spent her days crafting artisanal bracelets and earrings for an online boutique that barely broke even. He had no idea that Nova Strategic had quietly acquired a controlling interest in Pinnacle Marketing Solutions over the past 6 months, the very company where he worked, the company that had just honored him with this award. As he continued his speech, thanking his team and his mentors, I excused myself from the table and stepped onto the convention center's outdoor terrace. The desert evening air was cool against my skin, a welcome relief from the stifling atmosphere inside. I pulled out my phone and scrolled through the messages from Angela Roberts, my business partner, and the only person who knew the full extent of the double life I'd been living. "Watching the live stream," her text read. "Simple housewife? Really? Want me to release the acquisition announcement tonight instead of waiting for Monday?" I typed back quickly, "Monday as planned. Let him enjoy his moment." But even as I sent the message, I wondered why I was extending this courtesy. Why did I continue to protect David's ego when he clearly had no qualms about diminishing mine in front of hundreds of people? The answer, I knew, lay in the complicated history of how we'd gotten to this point. 4 years ago, I'd been a different version of myself. Fresh off a bitter divorce from my college sweetheart who'd left me for his secretary, I was rebuilding both my personal life and my fledgling consulting business. Nova Strategic was 2 years old, operating out of a cramped office space I shared with 3 other small businesses. And while it was growing steadily, I was still very much in the grinding phase of entrepreneurship. I met David at a charity mixer for the Phoenix Arts Foundation, an event I'd attended reluctantly at Angela's insistence that I needed to get out more. He was charming, successful, and refreshingly straightforward after the emotional manipulation I'd endured in my previous marriage. When he approached me at the bar, confident in his tailored suit and easy smile, I found myself genuinely interested in conversation for the first time in months. "I don't think I've seen you at these events before," he'd said, ordering us both drinks without asking what I wanted. It should have been a red flag, but I was so grateful for male attention that wasn't calculating or cruel that I overlooked it. "I'm usually too busy with work," I'd replied, accepting the wine he handed me even though I preferred beer. "What kind of work?" he'd asked, and when I mentioned consulting, his eyes had lit up with interest. "That's fascinating. I'm in marketing myself, account management mostly. What kind of consulting?" I'd started to explain Nova Strategic's focus on digital transformation and organizational restructuring, but within minutes, David had taken over the conversation. He began explaining marketing principles to me as if I were a child, mansplaining. Concepts I'd studied in graduate school and implemented successfully for dozens of clients. When I tried to interject with my own expertise, he'd nod patronizingly and redirect back to his own experiences. By the end of that first conversation, I'd made a decision that would define the next 4 years of my life. Rather than correct his assumptions about my capabilities or challenge his need to be the expert in every interaction, I'd simply smiled and let him believe he was teaching me something. It was easier than confrontation, and after the emotional warfare of my first marriage, I craved peace above all else. Our courtship had followed this pattern. David was attentive and generous, always ready with advice about business, finances, and life in general. He genuinely seemed to care about my well-being, even if his concern was tinged with condescension. When he suggested I focus on something more sustainable than consulting, pointing out the irregularity of my income and the stress of client acquisition, I found myself nodding along. "Have you considered something more creative?" he'd suggested during one of our early dates. "You're so artistic, always sketching in that notebook. Maybe jewelry design or photography? Something that could grow into a nice side business without the pressure of supporting yourself entirely." The suggestion had stung, but I'd recognized the genuine affection behind it. David wasn't trying to hurt me. He simply couldn't conceive of a world where I might be more successful than he was. His worldview required him to be the provider, the advisor, the one with superior knowledge and earning power. To maintain our relationship, I'd have to fit into that framework. So I'd created the perfect fiction. I'd told him that I was scaling back my consulting work, taking on fewer clients, focusing more on creative pursuits. I'd started an Etsy shop selling the jewelry I'd made as a hobby since college, carefully managing its success to look modest but not embarrassing. Meanwhile, Nova Strategic continued to grow under my careful guidance, with Angela serving as the public face of the company while I operated from behind the scenes. The deception had started small. A client meeting became a coffee date with girlfriends. A strategy session became a jewelry-making workshop. Revenue from a major contract was attributed to a lucky month of online sales. David never questioned these explanations because they fit his preconceptions perfectly. His wife was creative but not too ambitious, artistic but not financially successful, supportive but not competitive. For 3 years, this arrangement had worked reasonably well. David got to be the primary breadwinner and the source of business wisdom in our household. I got peace, stability, and the freedom to build my company without his well-intentioned interference. Our Sunrise Hills home, which I'd purchased with Nova Strategic profits but he believed was financed through his salary and my small contributions, became a sanctuary where I could play the role of grateful wife while secretly orchestrating million-dollar deals from my home office. But the strain of living a double life had begun to show in ways I hadn't anticipated. The constant performance was exhausting. Every dinner party where I had to pretend ignorance about business trends I'd predicted, every social gathering where I smiled while David explained my own industry to other guests, every casual conversation where I had to bite my tongue to avoid revealing knowledge I supposedly didn't possess. The worst part wasn't the deception itself, but the way it had changed how David saw me. Over the years, his protective condescension had hardened into something closer to dismissal. He'd stopped asking about my work entirely, referring to my jewelry business as my little hobby and my occasional consulting projects as helping out some friends. When I'd suggested we invest in real estate or offered opinions about his career decisions, he'd pat my hand and change the subject, as if my thoughts on such matters were sweet but irrelevant. I'd watched him evolve from a man who'd been genuinely interested in my perspective to someone who assumed I had nothing valuable to contribute to serious conversations. The tragedy was that this transformation wasn't malicious. David loved me in his way. He was faithful, generous with his affection and his money, proud to introduce me as his wife at company functions. But he loved a version of me that didn't exist. a carefully curated persona designed to make him comfortable rather than challenge his assumptions about gender, success, and partnership. The breaking point had come 6 months earlier, when Pinnacle Marketing Solutions had appeared on my radar as a potential acquisition target. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Angela had brought the opportunity to me, noting that the mid-sized agency was struggling with digital transformation and had been hemorrhaging clients to more innovative competitors. Their leadership team was aging, their technology was outdated, and their approach to client relations was increasingly out of step with modern business practices. "It's a perfect fit for our expansion strategy," Angela had explained during one of our evening strategy sessions at my home office. A converted bedroom that David believed was my jewelry workshop. "They've got solid client relationships and good brand recognition, but they need serious organizational restructuring. We could triple their revenue within 2 years with the right changes." I'd agreed to move forward with preliminary discussions, not immediately connecting Pinnacle to David's employer. It wasn't until we were deep into due diligence that I'd realized the agency my company was preparing to acquire was the same place where my husband worked as a senior account director, the same company where he'd been steadily climbing the ladder for the past 5 years. The irony was almost too perfect to believe. David had spent years explaining marketing strategy to me, offering unsolicited advice about business development, and condescendingly suggesting I didn't understand the complexities of client management. Meanwhile, I was about to become the owner of his employer, equipped with detailed financial records that revealed every aspect of his professional performance, including several concerning patterns I was sure he wasn't aware I could see. The due diligence process had been illuminating in ways I hadn't expected. Pinnacle's internal communications revealed a workplace culture that was far more problematic than I'd realized. There were email chains discussing which clients should be assigned to female account managers and which were too important for women to handle. There were performance reviews that consistently rated women lower than men for identical achievements. There were salary disparities that couldn't be explained by experience or performance metrics. David's name appeared throughout these communications, not as a primary instigator, but as someone who participated in the culture without questioning it. He'd forwarded jokes that were inappropriate at best, expressed skepticism about female colleagues' capabilities, and consistently supported promotion, decisions that favored men over equally or more qualified women. Reading these exchanges had been like watching my husband through a window I'd never had access to before, seeing how he interacted with professional women when he didn't think anyone who mattered was watching. The most damning evidence had been a series of emails about Michelle Park, Pinnacle's HR director and one of only 3 women in leadership positions at the company. Michelle had been advocating for policy changes to address the gender disparities in pay and promotion, submitting detailed reports and recommendations that were consistently dismissed or ignored by the executive team. In one particularly revealing exchange, David had written to his colleague Ryan Thompson, "Michelle's getting a little too aggressive with this equality stuff. Someone should remind her that clients want to work with people they can relate to, and most of our major accounts are run by men who prefer dealing with other men." Ryan had responded with enthusiasm. "Exactly. She doesn't understand that pushing this agenda too hard could cost us business. Some traditions exist for good reasons." Reading those emails had crystallized something for me that I'd been avoiding for months. The man I'd married wasn't just casually sexist in the way that many men of his generation were. He was actively contributing to systemic discrimination against women in his workplace, while simultaneously coming home to a wife whose professional capabilities he consistently underestimated and dismissed. The acquisition had taken on a different meaning after that discovery. It wasn't just a business opportunity anymore. It was a chance to address the toxic culture that had been allowed to flourish at Pinnacle, and perhaps to finally reveal to David exactly who he'd been married to all these years. As I stood on the convention center terrace, watching the Phoenix skyline twinkle in the distance, I thought about Monday morning. In less than 72 hours, David would walk into his office to find an email announcing that Pinnacle Marketing Solutions had been acquired by Nova Strategic Consulting, effective immediately. He would learn that his new ultimate boss was the CEO of Nova Strategic, a mysterious figure who'd managed to stay largely out of the public eye despite the company's growing influence in the Arizona business community. What he wouldn't learn, at least not immediately, was that the CEO in question was his wife. That revelation would come later, in a carefully orchestrated moment that I'd been planning for weeks. Because if David was going to continue treating me like a simple housewife who didn't understand the complexities of business, he needed to experience the full impact of exactly how wrong he'd been. The convention center doors opened behind me, and I heard David's voice calling my name. I turned to see him approaching, his award tucked under his arm, his face flushed with excitement and alcohol. "There you are," he said, wrapping his arm around my waist. "I was looking everywhere for you. Did you hear the speech? Pretty good, right?" "It was wonderful," I replied, the words tasting like ash in my mouth. "I'm so proud of you." "This is just the beginning," he continued, his voice filled with the kind of confidence that came from public recognition and premium whiskey. "Ryan thinks I'm being considered for promotion to VP level. Can you imagine? Jessica Martinez-Chen, wife of a vice president." I smiled and nodded, letting him paint this picture of our future together. A future where his career continued its upward trajectory, while mine remained safely contained within the bounds of acceptable feminine ambition. A future where he made the important decisions and I provided support and admiration from the sidelines. It was a future that would never come to pass, though David didn't know that yet. Because on Monday morning, everything would change. The simple housewife he'd just described to a room full of Phoenix's business leaders would finally step out of the shadows and into her true role as his boss, his equal, and perhaps the catalyst for the most important reckoning of his life. But tonight, I would let him have his moment of triumph. Tomorrow, I would finalize the last details of the acquisition with Angela and our legal team. And Monday, David would discover that the woman he'd been underestimating for 4 years had just bought the company that employed him. The thought should have filled me with satisfaction, but instead I felt a deep sadness for what we were about to lose. Because once the truth came out, there would be no going back to the comfortable fiction we'd built together. Our marriage, built on carefully maintained lies and mutual misunderstanding, would either evolve into something completely different or it would end entirely. As David guided me back toward our table, chattering excitedly about the contacts he'd made and the opportunities that might arise from tonight's recognition, I wondered which outcome I was hoping for. Did I want to save our marriage, or was I simply preparing to destroy it in the most dramatic way possible? The answer, I realized, would depend entirely on how David chose to respond when he discovered that his simple housewife had been anything but simple all along. Monday morning arrived with the kind of crystalline clarity that only comes after a desert storm. I stood in my home office, watching David through the window as he loaded his briefcase into his BMW, completely unaware that this would be the last morning he left for work as simply a senior account director at Pinnacle Marketing Solutions. My phone buzzed with a message from Angela. "Press release goes live in 10 minutes. Legal team standing by. You ready for this?" I typed back, "As ready as I'll ever be." The weekend had passed in a surreal blur of normalcy. David had spent Saturday morning playing golf with Ryan Thompson, regaling me over dinner with stories of their conversation about potential promotions and the bright future ahead at Pinnacle. Sunday had been devoted to meal prep and household tasks, with David offering his usual helpful suggestions about my time management while I mentally reviewed acquisition protocols and integration timelines. He'd been particularly affectionate since the award ceremony, energized by the recognition and optimistic about his career trajectory. Saturday night, as we'd lain in bed, he'd spoken dreamily about the house we might buy once his promotion came. through the vacation we could take to celebrate, the security we'd finally achieve. "You won't have to worry about your little business anymore," he'd murmured against my shoulder. "Once I make VP, we'll have enough that you can just focus on the things you enjoy. Maybe take some art classes, join a book club. You could finally have the life you deserve." The life I deserved. The phrase had echoed in my mind all weekend, a bitter reminder of how completely David misunderstood what I actually wanted from life. In his vision of our future, my happiness was contingent on his success, my fulfillment dependent on his ability to provide for me. The idea that I might have my own ambitions, my own definition of achievement, simply didn't compute within his worldview. At exactly 9 o'clock, the press release went live across multiple business publications and news outlets. The headline was straightforward. Nova Strategic Consulting acquires Pinnacle Marketing Solutions in $4.2 million deal. The article detailed the acquisition's strategic rationale, Nova's plans for digital transformation and cultural modernization, and included quotes from both companies' leadership teams praising the partnership's potential. What the press release didn't mention was that Nova Strategic's famously reclusive CEO, who had built the company from a startup into a regional powerhouse while maintaining an almost mythical level of privacy, would finally be stepping into the public eye as part of the integration process. My secure phone rang at 9:15. Angela's voice was crisp and professional, but I could hear the underlying excitement. "It's done. The announcement is live, and Pinnacle's executive team has been notified. Emergency all-hands meeting scheduled for 10:30. You sure you want to do this in person?" I glanced at my reflection in the window, seeing both versions of myself superimposed. Jessica Martinez-Chen, the supportive wife in her comfortable yoga pants and oversized sweater, and Jessica Martinez, CEO of Nova Strategic, whose power suits hung in a hidden section of our walk-in closet that David had never bothered to explore. "I'm sure. Have Michelle Park prepare the presentation on workplace culture initiatives. I want the entire staff to understand that this acquisition isn't just about financial restructuring." "Already done. She's been working on it all weekend. I think you'll be impressed with her recommendations." After we hung up, I sat in my office chair, surrounded by the carefully constructed evidence of my fictional life. The jewelry-making supplies that actually got used, the craft books that weren't just props, the modest computer setup that David believed represented the extent of my technical capabilities. This room had been my sanctuary and my prison for 4 years, the place where I'd maintained the elaborate fiction that had preserved our marriage while slowly destroying my sense of self. In 2 hours, I would walk into Pinnacle's conference room and reveal myself as the new owner of the company where my husband worked. The thought should have been thrilling, but instead it felt like standing at the edge of a cliff, knowing that the jump was necessary but unable to predict where I would land. David's text arrived at 9:45. "Crazy morning at the office. Some consulting company bought us. Emergency meeting in an hour. Might be late tonight." I typed back, "Good luck. Hope everything works out." The irony of the exchange wasn't lost on me. For 4 years, I'd been offering empty reassurances about his work situation while secretly managing the very forces that shaped his professional life. Now, finally, I was about to stop being a bystander in his career and start being the person who determined its direction. At 10:15, I began the transformation from housewife to CEO. The process had become routine over the years, but today it felt ceremonial, like putting on armor before battle. The charcoal gray suit that made me look serious and authoritative. The ruby red blouse that added just enough color to avoid looking intimidating. The pearl earrings that had belonged to my grandmother, a reminder of the strong women who had come before me. As I applied my makeup, I thought about the presentation I'd prepared for today's meeting. It wasn't just about announcing the acquisition or outlining integration plans. It was about introducing myself to Pinnacle's employees as their new leader, while simultaneously revealing to my husband that the woman he'd been married to for 4 years was someone he'd never truly known. The drive to Pinnacle's offices took me through the heart of Phoenix's business district, past the restaurants where David and I had celebrated anniversaries, the coffee shops where I'd conducted secret client meetings, the hotels where Nova Strategic had hosted industry conferences that David had attended without ever realizing his wife was the person behind them. Pinnacle Marketing Solutions occupied 3 floors of a gleaming office tower with panoramic views of the desert mountains that ringed the city. I'd visited the building dozens of times over the years, attending David's company parties and holiday celebrations, always as the supportive spouse, rather than the strategic mind evaluating the business's potential. Angela was waiting in the lobby, her expression carefully neutral, but her eyes bright with anticipation. "Ready?" she asked simply, and I nodded, following her to the elevator that would take us to the 14th floor. The conference room was packed with Pinnacle's entire staff, from entry-level assistants to the executive team. I recognized many faces from company events, people who had smiled politely at me while David introduced me as his wife who dabbled in jewelry design. Now they would learn that I was about to become their boss. Michelle Park stood at the front of the room, her presentation materials ready, her expression professionally composed despite what I knew must be tremendous personal satisfaction. For 3 years, she'd been fighting an uphill battle against Pinnacle's discriminatory culture, documenting inequities and advocating for change only to be dismissed or ignored by the very men who were about to discover they now reported to a woman. David sat in the 3rd row, his notebook open, his expression focused and slightly anxious. Ryan Thompson was beside him, and I could see them exchanging whispered speculations about what the acquisition might mean for their positions. Neither of them had any idea that the person who would be making those decisions was about to walk through the door. At exactly 10:30, I entered the conference room with Angela at my side. The conversations died immediately as every head turned toward us. I saw confusion on most faces, recognition on a few, and complete shock on the faces of those who knew me as David's wife, but couldn't reconcile that identity with my current professional appearance. David's expression went through a rapid series of changes. Confusion at seeing me in the office during a workday, surprise at my formal attire, bewilderment at my presence at what was clearly a high-level business meeting. And then, as Angela moved to the presentation screen and I took my position at the front of the room, the dawning realization that something was fundamentally wrong with his understanding of the situation. "Good morning," I began, my voice carrying the authority I'd developed over 6 years of leading Nova Strategic through challenges and growth. "I'm Jessica Martinez, CEO and founder of Nova Strategic Consulting. Thank you all for making time for this important meeting." The silence in the room was deafening. I could see people processing my words, trying to reconcile the woman they knew as David Chen's wife with the powerful executive standing before them. David himself had gone completely pale, his pen frozen in his hand, his mouth slightly open, as if he were trying to speak, but couldn't find the words. "As you've learned this morning, Nova Strategic has acquired Pinnacle Marketing Solutions in a transaction that positions both companies for significant growth and expansion," I continued, clicking to the first slide of my presentation. "This acquisition represents more than a financial investment. It's a commitment to transforming Pinnacle into a modern, inclusive, and innovative organization that can compete effectively in today's rapidly evolving marketplace." I clicked to the next slide, which showed Nova Strategic's impressive growth trajectory over the past 6 years. Nova Strategic has built its reputation on delivering results through strategic thinking, cutting-edge technology, and most importantly, by creating workplace cultures where every employee can contribute their best work regardless of gender, background, or personal circumstances. From the corner of my eye, I could see David's hands shaking slightly as he tried to process what was happening. Ryan Thompson kept glancing between me and David, his expression shifting from confusion to something approaching panic as he began to understand the implications of this revelation. Over the next 90 days, we'll be implementing comprehensive changes to Pinnacle's organizational structure, compensation systems, and workplace policies, I continued, advancing to a slide that outlined the integration timeline. These changes are designed to address documented inequities and create an environment where every employee can thrive professionally. Michelle Park stepped forward to begin her portion of the presentation, her voice steady and professional. Despite what I knew must be tremendous personal vindication, our analysis has identified several areas where Pinnacle's current practices fall short of industry standards for workplace equality and inclusion, she began, clicking to a slide that showed the stark salary disparities between male and female employees. As Michelle detailed the changes that would be implemented, I watched the reactions around the room. The women, particularly the younger ones, were sitting up straighter, their expressions hopeful for the first time since I'd known them. The men, especially those in leadership positions, looked increasingly uncomfortable as the scope of the cultural transformation became clear. David hadn't moved since I'd introduced myself. He sat frozen in his chair, his notebook forgotten, his eyes fixed on me with an expression I'd never seen before. It wasn't anger or betrayal exactly. It was the look of someone whose entire understanding of reality had just been fundamentally shattered. "I want to address directly the elephant in the room," I said, taking control of the presentation as Michelle concluded her remarks. "Some of you know me in a different context, as the wife of David Chen, your senior account director. I understand that this revelation may be surprising, and I want to assure everyone that personal relationships will have no bearing on professional decisions or evaluations." A murmur went through the room as people processed this confirmation of what they'd begun to suspect. I could see colleagues glancing at David with expressions ranging from sympathy to curiosity to barely concealed Schadenfreude. All personnel decisions will be based solely on performance, qualifications, and alignment with Nova Strategic's values and culture, I continued. Every employee will have the opportunity to demonstrate their capabilities and commitment to our shared goals during the integration process. I clicked to the final slide, which outlined the next steps in the transition. Department heads will receive detailed briefings on the organizational changes over the next week. Individual meetings will be scheduled to discuss career development opportunities and address any concerns about the transition. Our goal is to make this process as smooth and transparent as possible. As I wrapped up the presentation, I could feel the weight of dozens of stares, but none more intense than David's. When I finally met his eyes, I saw a mixture of emotions that I couldn't fully interpret. Shock, certainly. Confusion, definitely. But also something that might have been hurt, or anger, or perhaps a dawning understanding of how completely he'd misunderstood the woman he'd married. "Are there any questions?" I asked, opening the floor to the room. Several hands went up. Immediately. A junior account manager asked about job security during the transition. One of the senior designers wanted to know about creative control under the new ownership. Michelle fielded questions about the timeline for implementing new HR policies, but David didn't raise his hand. He didn't ask a single question. He just sat there, staring at me as if trying to solve a puzzle that had suddenly become infinitely more complex than he'd ever imagined. As the meeting concluded and people began to file out, I could hear the excited whispers beginning. This would be the talk of Phoenix's business community within hours. The mysterious CEO of Nova Strategic had finally revealed herself, and she turned out to be the wife of one of the acquired company's employees. The story would spread through social media, industry publications, and cocktail party conversations with the speed of wildfire. David remained in his seat as the room emptied, his notebook still closed, his expression still shell-shocked. Ryan. Thompson lingered near the door, clearly wanting to approach David, but unsure of the appropriate protocol for consoling a colleague whose wife had just bought their company. "David," I said quietly, once we were alone except for Angela, who was packing up the presentation materials. "Could I speak with you privately?" He nodded mutely and followed me to a smaller conference room down the hall. Angela gave me an encouraging look as she left us alone, closing the door behind her. For a long moment, we just stared at each other across the polished table. David's usual confidence had evaporated, replaced by a vulnerability I'd rarely seen in our 4 years of marriage. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "How long?" he asked. "How long what? How long have you been lying to me? How long have you been running this company while pretending to be someone else?" I took a breath, preparing to answer questions I'd known would come, but had never quite figured out how to address. Nova Strategic has existed for 6 years. I founded it 2 years before we met. I've been managing the company throughout our entire relationship. He absorbed this information, his expression cycling through disbelief, anger, and something approaching grief. "So, everything you told me about scaling back your consulting work, focusing on creative projects, needing my financial support, all of it was lies." "Not lies exactly," I said carefully. "More like selective truth. I do make jewelry. I do enjoy creative projects. But yes, I've been running Nova Strategic the entire time we've been together." "Why?" The question came out as almost a plea. "Why would you do this? Why would you pretend to be someone you're not for 4 years?" I sat down across from him, trying to find words that would explain a decision that had seemed logical at the time, but now felt almost impossible to justify. "Do you remember when we first met? At the Arts Foundation mixer?" He nodded, his expression wary. "You spent the entire evening explaining marketing concepts to me, talking about business strategy as if I were a child who needed education. You were so confident, so certain that you knew more than I did about everything. And I made a choice that night to let you believe that was true." "But why?" he asked again, his voice rising slightly. "Why not just tell me who you really were?" "Because I was tired of fighting," I said honestly. "My first marriage ended partly because my ex-husband couldn't handle my success. He felt threatened by my ambition, resentful of my achievements. When I met you, I thought I could avoid that conflict by simply not revealing the full extent of my professional life." David was quiet for a long moment, processing this explanation. When he spoke again, his voice was calmer but edged with hurt. "So you decided I was too sexist, too fragile to handle the truth about your success?" "I decided I was too tired to find out," I corrected. "And then, as time went on, it became harder and harder to tell the truth. You were so comfortable with the dynamic we'd established, so proud of being the provider and the business expert in our relationship. I didn't know how to disrupt that without destroying what we'd built together." "What we'd built together," he repeated, a bitter laugh escaping him. "You mean the elaborate fiction you created to keep me happy and compliant?" The accusation stung because it contained more truth than I wanted to admit. "I mean the life we shared, the love we felt for each other, the partnership we created, even if it was based on incomplete information." "Incomplete information?" David's voice was rising again. "Jessica, you bought my company without telling me. You've been my boss for months without me knowing it. This isn't incomplete information. It's a fundamental deception about who you are." He stood up abruptly, pacing to the window that overlooked the Phoenix skyline. "I trusted you completely. I shared everything with you about my work, my concerns, my ambitions. And the entire time, you were secretly in a position to influence or control all of it. I wanted to defend myself, to explain that I'd never used the information he'd shared to his detriment, that I'd been scrupulously careful to keep our personal relationship separate from my professional decisions." but I could see that from his perspective, the betrayal was complete and devastating. "What happens now?" he asked, turning back to face me. "Do I still have a job? Are you going to fire me for being married to someone who kept secrets from me?" "Your job is secure," I said firmly. "Your performance will be evaluated on the same criteria as every other employee. Our personal relationship won't factor into professional decisions." "Our personal relationship," he repeated, shaking his head. "Is there still a personal relationship? Because I don't know who you are anymore, Jessica. The woman I married, the woman I've been living with for 4 years, apparently doesn't exist." The pain in his voice was raw and genuine, and I felt an unexpected surge of grief for what we were losing. "She does exist," I said quietly. "She's just not the only version of me." "But she's the version you thought I needed," he said, his insight cutting deeper than any accusation. "You looked at me and decided I couldn't handle the real you, so you gave me a diminished version instead." I had no answer for that because he was right. I had made assumptions about his character, his capacity for growth, his ability to love a woman who was more successful than he was. In trying to protect our relationship, I had perhaps ensured its eventual destruction. "I need time," David said finally, moving toward the door. "I need to process this, figure out what it means for us personally and professionally. I can't do that sitting in this conference room with my wife who just revealed she's been lying to me for our entire marriage." As he reached for the door handle, I called out to him, "David, wait. I know this is a shock, but I hope you'll consider that I didn't do this to hurt you. I did it because I loved you and wanted to protect what we had together." He paused, his hand on the door, his back to me. "The thing is, Jessica, I'm not sure what we had together was ever real. If you couldn't trust me with the truth about something so fundamental, maybe we never really knew each other at all." With that, he left, closing the door quietly behind him. I sat alone in the conference room, staring out at the city where I'd built my professional empire while maintaining an elaborate personal charade. The revelation I'd planned so carefully had gone exactly as I'd expected, but the emotional cost was higher than I'd anticipated. My phone buzzed with a text from Angela. "How did it go?" I typed back, "As well as could be expected, and as badly as I feared." The rest of the day would be filled with practical concerns. Integration planning, employee meetings, media interviews about the acquisition. But for now, I sat in the quiet conference room, mourning the end of a marriage that had been built on love and lies in equal measure, and wondering if there was any way to build something honest from the rubble of what we'd destroyed. The silence that greeted me when I walked through our front door that evening was unlike any quiet I'd experienced in our Sunrise Hills home. It wasn't the comfortable quiet of a shared space where two people coexisted peacefully. It was the hollow silence of a house where trust had been shattered and every familiar object now carried the weight of deception. David's car was in the driveway, but he wasn't in any of the common areas. I found him in our bedroom, methodically packing clothes into the suitcase we'd used for our honeymoon in Sedona 4 years ago. The irony of the luggage choice wasn't lost on me, watching him fold shirts with mechanical precision while surrounded by the artifacts of our shared life. "Going somewhere?" I asked from the doorway, though the answer was obvious. He didn't look up from his packing. "Ryan's guest room, temporarily, until I figure out something more permanent." Ryan Thompson's house. Of course, David was seeking refuge with the colleague who had been equally complicit in perpetuating Pinnacle's discriminatory culture, the friend who had dismissed Michelle Park's advocacy for equality as being too aggressive. The choice felt like another small betrayal, though I couldn't articulate exactly why. "We should talk about this," I said, stepping into the room that had been our sanctuary for 4 years. "Should we?" David finally met my eyes, and I was startled by the coldness I saw there. Because I'm not sure what there is to discuss. You've made your position clear. You're the CEO, I'm the employee. You're the decision maker, I'm the person whose professional fate you control. What exactly did you want to talk about? I sat on the edge of our bed, watching him fold a sweater I'd given him last Christmas. I wanted to talk about us, about our marriage, about whether there's any way to move forward from this. David's laugh was sharp and humorless. Move forward? Jessica, you spent 4 years pretending to be someone you're not. You let me believe I was the breadwinner while you were secretly supporting us both. You bought my company without telling me. Which part of that foundation exactly do you think we should build on? The questions hung in the air between us, each one a legitimate grievance that I had no adequate answer for. I had violated the basic premises of partnership, transparency, and mutual respect that any healthy marriage required. The fact that my motivations had been protective rather than malicious didn't change the fundamental breach of trust. I know I made mistakes, I began, but David cut me off with a sharp gesture. Mistakes? Jessica, mistakes are forgetting to pay a bill or double booking dinner plans. What you did was construct an elaborate alternate reality designed to manage my ego while protecting your secret identity. That's not a mistake. That's a sustained campaign of deception. He was right, and his clarity about the situation was more devastating than anger would have been. David had always been analytical, capable of breaking down complex problems into their component parts. Now he was applying that same ruthless logic to our marriage, and the diagnosis was terminal. You want to know what the worst part is? He continued, zipping up the suitcase with more force than necessary. It's not that you lied to me for 4 years. It's that you clearly believed I deserved to be lied to. You looked at me and decided I was too small, too threatened, too pathetic to handle the truth about who I was married to. The accusation hit like a physical blow because it contained a kernel of truth I'd been avoiding. I had made assumptions about David's character, his capacity for growth, his ability to love a successful woman. But those assumptions had been based on his own behavior, his own words, his own demonstrated attitudes toward professional women. That's not fair, I said, finding my voice. You gave me plenty of reasons to believe you couldn't handle my success. Do you remember what you said about Sarah Martinez when she was promoted to regional manager at your old company? You called her a diversity hire who probably slept her way to the top. David's expression flickered with something that might have been shame, but he rallied quickly. That was years ago, before I met you. People say stupid things sometimes. And what about Lisa Crawford? When she started her consulting firm last year, you said she was delusional to think she could compete with established companies. You said women don't have the killer instinct for high-level business negotiations. I never said that. You absolutely did. It was at the Hendersons' barbecue in May. You and Ryan were discussing whether to recommend her services to a client, and you both agreed she wasn't aggressive enough for serious business. David's silence confirmed that he remembered the conversation, even if he didn't want to acknowledge it. I pressed on, years of suppressed frustration finally finding voice. And what about every time I tried to offer an opinion about your work situations? Every time I suggested a different approach to a client problem or a strategic decision? You would smile and pat my hand and change the subject, as if my thoughts on business matters were sweet but irrelevant. You never told me you had any expertise in business strategy, David protested. How was I supposed to know your opinions were based on professional experience? You weren't supposed to know that, but you were supposed to consider that they might have value anyway. You were supposed to respect my intelligence and judgment even if you thought I was just a housewife who made jewelry. The word housewife hung between us, loaded with all the dismissal and condescension it had carried throughout our marriage. I had played the role so convincingly that David had forgotten I was anything more than that, and perhaps I had forgotten too. So, this is My fault? David's voice was rising again. My sexist attitudes forced you to lie to me for 4 years? My inability to appreciate your intelligence made it necessary for you to create an entirely false identity? No, I said firmly. My choices were my own, but they were choices made in response to a relationship dynamic that you actively created and maintained. You wanted to be married to someone who needed your guidance and expertise. I gave you exactly what you wanted. David stared at me for a long moment, his expression cycling through anger, hurt, and something approaching recognition. You're right, he said finally. I did want that. I wanted to be the successful one, the wise one, the provider. It made me feel important, necessary. The admission surprised me with its honesty. I had expected continued defensiveness, not this sudden vulnerability. But that doesn't justify what you did, he continued. If you couldn't accept me as I was, if my attitudes were so problematic that you felt the need to hide your true self, why did you marry me at all? It was a question I had asked myself countless times over the past 4 years, especially during the lonely moments when maintaining my dual identity felt like an unbearable burden. Why had I chosen to build a life with someone I couldn't trust, with the truth about who I was? Because I loved you, I said simply. Despite your flaws, despite the ways you diminished me sometimes, I loved the man you were when you were being your best self. I loved your generosity, your loyalty, your determination to succeed. I thought I could love you enough to change the parts that were problematic. And I thought I could be happy with a wife who needed me to explain the world to her, David Atiais replied. I guess we both fell in love with edited versions of each other. The observation was painfully accurate. We had both presented ourselves as the people we thought the other person wanted, then built a marriage on those carefully curated personas. The love between us had been real, but it had been love for incomplete truths rather than authentic selves. David picked up his suitcase and moved toward the door. I need time to process all of this. The revelation about your company, the implications for my career, what it means for our marriage. I can't do that while living in the same house where you've been maintaining this deception for 4 years. How much time? I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know the answer. I don't know. Weeks, maybe months. Long enough to figure out who I am when I'm not married to someone who thinks I need to be managed and protected from uncomfortable truths. The characterization stung because it was accurate. I had managed David's perception of reality for 4 years, carefully controlling what information he received about my professional life to maintain the fiction that supported our relationship. And what about work? I asked. How do you want to handle the professional situation? David paused at the bedroom door, his expression hardening. Professionally, I'll do my job and follow the new policies your company implements. I'll participate in whatever cultural transformation Michelle Park has planned. I'll be a model employee during this transition. But don't expect me to pretend that everything is normal. Don't expect me to sit in meetings and act like my wife isn't the person making decisions about my career. And don't expect me to come home and pretend that finding out you've been lying to me for 4 years hasn't fundamentally changed how I see you. With that, he left, and I heard his footsteps echoing through the house, followed by the sound of the front door closing and his car starting in the driveway. I sat alone in our bedroom, surrounded by the evidence of his hasty departure and the lingering questions about what came next. My phone buzzed with a call from Angela. How bad is it? She asked without preamble. He's moved out. Temporarily, he says, but it might be permanent. I'm sorry, Jess. I know this isn't how you wanted it to go. Isn't it? I asked, surprising myself with the question. Maybe some part of me wanted to blow up our marriage along with his preconceptions about who I am. Maybe I was tired of being diminished and wanted to demonstrate my power in the most dramatic way possible. Angela was quiet for a moment, considering this possibility. Do you think that's true? I don't know. I've been telling myself that I revealed the truth because the acquisition made it necessary, because living a double life was unsustainable. But maybe I also wanted David to experience what it felt like to discover that someone you trust has been fundamentally misunderstanding you. The difference is that his misunderstanding was based on assumptions and prejudices. Your deception was a deliberate choice to withhold information. True, but the result is the same. We're both discovering that we don't really know the person we married. After we hung up, I wandered through the house that felt suddenly too large and too quiet. Every room contained memories of our life together, artifacts of the relationship we'd built on carefully maintained lies and mutual misunderstanding. The kitchen where David had praised my cooking while I mentally reviewed client presentations. The living room where we'd watched movies together while I discreetly answered emails from my secure phone. The home office that he thought was my jewelry workshop, but had actually been the nerve center of a multi-million-dollar consulting operation. The following days blurred together in a haze of professional obligations and personal upheaval. The integration of Pinnacle into Nova Strategic proceeded smoothly on the surface, with most employees adapting well to the new policies and procedures. Michelle Park had thrown herself into the cultural transformation with enthusiasm, implementing training programs on unconscious bias, revising promotion criteria to eliminate gender disparities, and establishing clear protocols for addressing workplace discrimination. But underneath the professional success, tensions simmered. David maintained scrupulous professionalism during meetings, contributing thoughtfully to strategic discussions and following new protocols without complaint. However, his interactions with me were coldly formal, stripped of any personal warmth or acknowledgement of our shared history. Ryan Thompson had been less adaptable to the changes. His performance reviews revealed a pattern of resistance to the new policies, subtle undermining of female colleagues, and what Michelle diplomatically described as challenges with cultural alignment. After 2 weeks of documented incidents, I made the decision to terminate his employment, a move that sent ripples through the organization and likely confirmed David's suspicions about my willingness to use professional power to address personal grievances. "This looks like retaliation," David said during one of our brief, purely professional exchanges in the hallway. "Ryan's my friend, and now he's being fired by my wife's company." Ryan was terminated for documented performance issues and policy violations, I replied calmly. "His friendship with you had no bearing on the decision, didn't it?" David's expression was skeptical. He's been outspoken about the changes, critical of what he sees as overcorrection on gender issues. Suddenly, that makes him unemployable? What makes him unemployable is his documented pattern of discriminating against female colleagues and undermining company policies designed to create a more inclusive workplace. Would you prefer that I ignore that behavior because he's your friend? David had no answer for that, but I could see in his eyes that he didn't entirely believe my explanation. The paranoia was understandable. If I had been capable of deceiving him about something as fundamental as my career, what other deceptions might I be capable of? 3 weeks after the acquisition, Michelle Park requested a private meeting to discuss what she delicately termed ongoing personnel concerns. We met in my office on a Thursday afternoon, with the desert sun streaming through the windows and casting long shadows across the conference table. "I wanted to discuss David's situation," Michelle began, her voice carefully neutral. "His work performance has been excellent during the transition, but there are some interpersonal dynamics that are affecting team morale." "What kind of dynamics?" "Several female employees have mentioned feeling uncomfortable around him, not because of anything inappropriate he's said or done, but because of the tension surrounding his relationship with you. They're unsure how to interact with him professionally when his personal situation is so visible and complicated. I had anticipated this problem but hoped it might resolve itself as the initial shock of the revelation wore off. Apparently, that wasn't happening." There's also the issue of his credibility as a team leader, Michelle continued. Some colleagues are questioning whether his insights and recommendations can be trusted, given that he was apparently unaware of his wife's professional identity and capabilities. The observation was harsh but fair. David's reputation as a perceptive business strategist had been damaged by the revelation that he had fundamentally misunderstood the person closest to him. If he couldn't recognize the professional capabilities of his own wife, how could clients and colleagues trust his judgment about market trends or strategic opportunities? "What do you recommend?" I asked, though I suspected I already knew the answer. "I think David needs to be transferred to a different division, preferably one with minimal client contact initially. It would give him space to rebuild his professional reputation while removing the awkwardness of having him work directly under your organizational authority." The suggestion made practical sense, but it felt like another punishment for David's crime of being married to someone who had lied to him. He was being professionally sidelined not because of poor performance, but because his personal situation had become a distraction for his colleagues. "I'll consider it," I said finally. "Let me think about how to handle this sensitively." After Michelle left, I sat alone in my office, staring out at the Phoenix skyline and contemplating the unintended consequences of my revelation. I had wanted to step into my authentic power and force a reckoning with the gender dynamics that had shaped both my marriage and David's workplace. Instead, I had created a situation where everyone was uncomfortable, suspicious, and walking on eggshells around the explosive intersection of personal and professional relationships. That evening, I drove to Ryan Thompson's house, where David was staying temporarily. I hadn't been invited, but I needed to see him face to face, away from the formal constraints of the office environment. The house was in the same upscale subdivision where we lived, a reminder that David hadn't gone far geographically, even if he had traveled light years emotionally. Ryan answered the door, his expression shifting from surprise to hostility when he saw me. "Jessica, come to fire me in person?" "I came to talk to David. Is he here?" "He's here, but I'm not sure he wants to see you." David appeared behind Ryan, his expression weary but resigned. "It's fine, Ryan. Jessica, come in." We sat in Ryan's living room, the space feeling foreign and uncomfortable despite its similarity to dozens of other homes where we'd attended parties and social gatherings. Over the years, the awkwardness was compounded by Ryan's obvious resentment and his attempts to hover protectively near David. "Could we have some privacy?" I asked, and Ryan reluctantly retreated to another room, though not before shooting me a look that suggested he held me personally responsible for disrupting his comfortable world. "How are you doing?" I asked David, genuinely concerned about his well-being despite everything that had happened between us. "Surviving, adjusting, learning what it's like to have my professional reputation questioned because I didn't know my wife was secretly running a company." The bitterness in his voice was understandable, but it still hurt to hear. "I'm sorry about that. I know this situation has created complications for you at work." "Complications?" David shook his head. "Jessica, half my colleagues think I'm either incredibly naive or secretly complicit in some elaborate scheme. The other half are afraid to work with me because they don't know if anything they say might get back to you. My credibility as a business strategist has been destroyed because I couldn't recognize the business strategist I was married to." "That's not fair to you," I acknowledged. "You shouldn't be professionally penalized because I chose to keep my career secret. But I am being penalized, and honestly, maybe I should be. Maybe the fact that I completely missed who you really were says something important about my judgment, my perception, my ability to understand the people around me." The self-reflection surprised me. In the 3 weeks since the revelation, David had apparently been doing serious soul-searching about his role in our dysfunctional dynamic. "I've been thinking about what you said about my attitudes toward professional women," he continued. "You were right about Sarah Martinez, about Lisa Crawford, about the ways I dismissed their capabilities. I convinced myself those were isolated incidents, but they weren't. They were part of a pattern of assuming women in business were less competent, less strategic, less capable than men. What changed your mind? Working under Michelle Park for the past 3 weeks, watching her systematically dismantle discriminatory policies that I didn't even recognize as discriminatory. Seeing how much more effective and collaborative our team meetings became once she implemented new protocols for ensuring everyone's voice was heard. David paused, looking out the window at the desert landscape beyond Ryan's backyard. I realized that I'd been living in a bubble where casual sexism was so normalized that I couldn't see it anymore. Your deception wasn't just about protecting yourself from my potential reaction to your success. It was about protecting yourself from my ongoing pattern of diminishing women's professional capabilities. The admission was more than I had expected, a level of self-awareness that suggested genuine growth rather than defensive rationalization. So where does that leave us? I asked. I don't know, David said honestly. I understand better now why you felt you couldn't tell me the truth about your career. But understanding your motivations doesn't erase the fact that you chose deception over trust for 4 years. It doesn't change the fact that you bought my company without telling me, that you've been in a position to influence my career without my knowledge. I never used that influence to benefit you professionally, I said. Your performance evaluations, your assignments, your promotion opportunities were all based on merit. I believe that, David replied. But the fact remains that you had access to information about my professional life that I didn't know you had. You knew about confidential client situations, strategic decisions, personnel issues. The power imbalance in our relationship was even more severe than I realized. We sat in silence for a moment, both contemplating the magnitude of the trust that had been broken and the uncertainty of whether it could ever be repaired. Michelle thinks you should be transferred to a different division, I said finally. She's concerned that your presence in the current structure is creating uncomfortable dynamics for other employees. David nodded, unsurprised by this development. That's probably for the best. I can't be effective in my current role when everyone is wondering about my relationship with the CEO. Where would you want to go? What kind of work would interest you? I've been thinking about that. Maybe it's time for a complete change. Maybe I should leave Pinnacle entirely, start over somewhere else where my professional reputation isn't complicated by personal history. The possibility that David might leave not just our marriage, but also his career at the company I now owned hadn't occurred to me. The idea filled me with an unexpected sense of loss, as if his departure would sever one of the last connections between us. Is that what you want? I asked. I want to rebuild my professional identity based on my actual capabilities rather than my relationship to you, David said. I want to work somewhere where my colleagues respect my judgment because they've seen evidence of it, not because they're afraid of offending the boss's husband. And personally? What do you want personally? David was quiet for a long time, his expression thoughtful and sad. I want to figure out who I am when I'm not married to someone I fundamentally misunderstood. I want to understand why I was so comfortable with a relationship dynamic that required you to hide such an important part of yourself. I want to become the kind of person who could have celebrated your success instead of feeling threatened by it. And then maybe we can have a conversation about whether there's anything left between us worth building on. It wasn't the answer I had hoped for, but it was honest and realistic. David was acknowledging that our problems went deeper than my deception, that the foundation of our relationship had been compromised by attitudes and assumptions that needed to be addressed before any reconciliation could be possible. As I drove home through the Phoenix evening, past the familiar landmarks of the life we'd built together, I reflected on the complex chain of events that had brought us to this point. My revelation had accomplished what I'd intended. It had forced a reckoning with the gender dynamics and power imbalances that had shaped our relationship. But it had also destroyed the marriage I'd been trying to protect. leaving both of us to figure out who we were as individuals before we could determine whether we had any future together. The house felt empty when I arrived, but it was a different kind of emptiness than the hollow silence of broken trust. It was the emptiness of possibility, of space cleared for something new to grow. Whether that something would include David remained to be seen. But for the first time in 4 years, I was living as my authentic self, and that authenticity felt like a kind of freedom I had almost forgotten was possible. 6 weeks had passed since David moved out, and I was learning to live alone in a house that had been designed for 2 people. The silence was no longer oppressive, but had become something I was slowly growing comfortable with. It was the silence of solitude rather than abandonment. The quiet space where I could finally think clearly about who I was when I wasn't performing the role of supportive wife. My morning routine had evolved to include things that David had never shown interest in. Yoga on the back patio overlooking the desert, reading business journals over coffee without having to explain why I found market analysis fascinating, taking conference calls in my home office without worrying about maintaining the fiction that it was merely a craft room. For the first time in 4 years, I was living as my complete self within these walls. The professional integration at Pinnacle had progressed more smoothly than I'd anticipated. Michelle Park had exceeded my expectations in her role as Cultural Transformation Director, a position I'd created specifically for her talents. The workplace culture surveys showed marked improvement in employee satisfaction, particularly among women and younger staff members. Client retention had remained stable despite the organizational changes, and several major accounts had specifically praised the more collaborative and innovative approach they'd experienced from our teams. David had requested and received a transfer to our newly established digital innovation department, a role that allowed him to focus on emerging technologies and strategic analysis, without the complicated interpersonal dynamics of his previous position. According to Michelle's reports, he was performing well in his new role, demonstrating the analytical skills and strategic thinking that had always been his professional strengths. We rarely interacted at the office anymore, our paths crossing only during large company meetings where we maintained scrupulous professionalism. The few times we'd spoken, our exchanges had been cordial but distant, like former colleagues who had once worked closely together but had moved to different departments. The intimacy that had once defined our relationship seemed to have evaporated entirely, replaced by a careful formality that protected us both from further emotional complications. Angela had been watching me navigate this new reality with a mixture of concern and admiration. "You seem different," she observed during one of our weekly strategy meetings. "More centered somehow, less anxious." She was right. The constant vigilance required to maintain my dual identity had been more exhausting than I'd realized. Living authentically, even in the aftermath of a marital separation, felt like finally being able to breathe deeply after years of holding my breath. "I think I've been running on adrenaline for so long that I forgot what it felt like to just exist normally," I told her. "Not having to monitor every conversation, every email, every phone call for potential slips that might reveal my real identity has been liberating." "And David? How are you handling his absence?" It was a question I'd been asking myself daily. The practical aspects of living alone had been surprisingly easy to adapt to. Cooking for one, managing household decisions without consultation, falling asleep in the center of our king-sized bed. But the emotional landscape was more complex. "I miss him," I admitted, "but I'm not sure if I miss David himself or just the idea of being married to someone. There's a difference between loneliness and missing a specific person, and I'm still figuring out which one I'm experiencing." "Have you considered couples counseling or individual therapy to help process everything that's happened?" The suggestion wasn't new. Several friends had mentioned therapy as a potential path forward, but I'd been resistant to the idea. Something about sitting in a room with a stranger and dissecting the elaborate deception I'd maintained for 4 years felt exposing in a way that even my public revelation hadn't been. "Maybe," I said noncommittally. "Right now I'm focusing on learning who I am when I'm not trying to be anyone else. That evening, as I was reviewing quarterly reports in my home office, my personal phone rang with an unknown Phoenix number. I almost didn't answer, but something made me pick up at the last moment. "Jessica, it's Patricia Chen." David's mother's voice was crisp and direct, carrying the same no-nonsense tone I remembered from our few interactions over the years. "Patricia, hello. How are you?" "I'm calling because I think it's time we had a conversation. David has told me about your situation, and I have some things to say that might be difficult for you to hear." I braced myself for the lecture I'd been expecting since the separation began. Patricia had always been protective of her son, and I assumed she was calling to express her disapproval of my deception and its impact on David's life. "I'm listening," I said, settling back in my chair and preparing for the worst. "David told me that you've been running a successful consulting company throughout your marriage, that you felt the need to hide your professional achievements from him because you thought he couldn't handle being married to a successful woman." That's essentially correct. And he's told me about some of the things he said over the years about women in business, the assumptions he made about your capabilities, the ways he dismissed your input on professional matters. Yes, that's also accurate. Patricia was quiet for a moment, and I could hear her breathing on the other end of the line. When she spoke again, her voice carried a weight of disappointment that surprised me. "I failed him as a mother," she said simply. "I raised a son who was so insecure about his own worth that he needed to feel superior to the woman he married. I raised a man who couldn't celebrate his wife's success because it threatened his sense of masculinity." The admission was so unexpected that I was momentarily speechless. I had prepared myself for blame and criticism, not this honest acknowledgement of the family dynamics that had shaped David's attitudes. "I've been thinking about this for weeks," Patricia continued. "About the marriage David's father and I modeled for him. About the messages we sent about gender roles and expectations. His father was a good man, but he was also a product of his generation. He believed that a man's worth was measured by his ability to provide for and protect his family, and that a strong woman was somehow a threat to that role. David mentioned that his father built his construction company from nothing," I said carefully. "That must have created a lot of pressure for David to achieve similar success." "It did, and I supported that pressure because I thought it would motivate him to work hard and succeed. What I didn't realize was that we were also teaching him that his value as a man was contingent on being more successful than the people around him, especially the women in his life." Patricia's analysis was uncomfortably perceptive, cutting to the heart of the insecurities and assumptions that had shaped David's behavior throughout our marriage. "I want you to know that I don't blame you for keeping your career secret," she said. "I think you recognize something about David's character that I failed to address when he was young. You saw that he wasn't emotionally mature enough to handle being married to a woman who was more professionally successful than he was." "I'm not sure that's entirely fair to David," I found myself saying, surprised by my instinct to defend him. "He's capable of growth and change. The past few weeks have shown me that he can recognize his mistakes and work to address them. Can he? Or is he just adapting to circumstances because he has no choice?" The question was brutally direct and forced me to examine David's recent behavior more critically. Was his apparent self-reflection genuine, or was it simply strategic? Adaptation to a situation he couldn't control? "I think it's genuine," I said slowly. "But I also think it's incomplete. Recognizing problematic attitudes is different from fundamentally changing the beliefs and assumptions that created those attitudes." "Exactly. Which is why I think you both need professional help to work through this situation, not couples. Counseling, at least not yet. Individual therapy to help you both understand how you ended up in such a dysfunctional dynamic." "Has David mentioned therapy?" "He's resistant to the idea, which doesn't surprise me. He's always been someone who wants to solve problems through analysis and effort rather than admitting he might need outside help. but some problems are too complex and too deeply rooted to solve alone. After we hung up, I sat in my office thinking about Patricia's observations. The idea that David's attitudes were the product of generational patterns and family dynamics didn't excuse his behavior, but it did provide context for understanding how we'd ended up in such a complicated situation. The following morning, I made an appointment with Dr. Sarah Blackwood, a therapist who specialized in relationship dynamics and workplace psychology. If I was going to move forward with my life, whether that included David or not, I needed to understand my own patterns of behavior and the choices that had led me to construct such an elaborate deception. Dr. Blackwood's office was in a converted, Victorian house in central Phoenix, decorated with warm colors and comfortable furniture that felt more like a living room than a clinical space. She was a woman in her 50s, with gray-streaked hair and intelligent eyes that seemed to see more than they revealed. "Tell me about what brought you here," she began, settling into her chair with a notepad balanced on her lap. I found myself telling the story from the beginning. Meeting David at the charity event, the decision to hide my professional identity, the years of maintaining dual lives, the acquisition that had forced the revelation, and the subsequent collapse of our marriage. Dr. Blackwood listened without interruption, occasionally taking notes, but mostly maintaining eye contact that felt both supportive and challenging. "What I'm hearing," she said when I finished, "is a story about two people who fell in love with edited versions of each other. You presented yourself as someone who needed guidance and protection. He presented himself as someone wise and capable of providing those things. Neither of you showed up authentically to the relationship." "But his deception was less deliberate," I protested. "He genuinely believed he was more knowledgeable and capable. I knew I was pretending to be someone I wasn't." "Did he, though? Or did he choose to believe he was superior because it was more comfortable than acknowledging your capabilities? Think about the moments when you tried to contribute to conversations about business or strategy. What happened in those interactions?" I considered her question, remembering the countless times I'd offered insights or suggestions only to have David redirect the conversation or dismiss my input. He would change the subject or explain why my ideas wouldn't work, usually without seriously considering them. So he was actively maintaining the fiction that you were less knowledgeable, even when you provided evidence to the contrary. That suggests his superiority complex wasn't entirely unconscious. The observation was uncomfortable because it implied that David had been more complicit in our dysfunctional dynamic than I'd been willing to acknowledge. It was easier to see myself as the primary deceiver and him as the unwitting victim, but the reality was more complicated. "What are you hoping to accomplish through therapy?" Dr. Blackwood asked. "Are you trying to save your marriage, or are you trying to understand yourself better regardless of what happens with David?" "Both, I think. Or maybe neither. I honestly don't know if our marriage is salvageable, but I do know that I don't want to repeat these patterns in future relationships." That's a good starting point. Let's talk about the decision to hide your professional identity. What were you hoping to achieve by maintaining that deception? "Peace," I said immediately. My first marriage ended partly because my ex-husband felt threatened by my ambition and success. I thought if I could avoid that conflict with David, we could have a stable, loving relationship. And did you have a stable, loving relationship? The question forced me to examine our marriage more honestly than I had in years. We had a relationship where I felt constantly diminished, and he felt constantly superior. I suppose it was stable, but I'm not sure it was truly loving if it required me to hide such a fundamental part of who I am. What would real love have looked like in that situation? David would have been curious about my intelligence and capabilities rather than assuming I lacked them. He would have celebrated my successes rather than feeling threatened by them. He would have seen me as an equal partner rather than someone who needed his guidance and protection. And what would real love have looked like from your side? I would have trusted him enough to be honest about who I was. I would have given him the opportunity to surprise me with his capacity for growth and change. I would have addressed his problematic attitudes directly rather than working around them through deception. The session continued for another 30 minutes, touching on family dynamics, gender socialization, and the ways that societal expectations had shaped both my and David's approaches to marriage and partnership. By the time I left Dr. Blackwood's office, I felt emotionally wrung out, but also clearer about the complexity of our situation. That evening, I received a text from David. "Can we meet for coffee? I have something I want to discuss with you." We met at Desert Grounds, a coffee shop in Old Town Scottsdale that had been one of our favorite places during our early dating years. David looked tired, but more relaxed than I'd seen him in weeks, wearing jeans and a casual shirt rather than his usual business attire. "How are you doing?" I asked after we'd ordered our drinks and found a table in a quiet corner. "Better, I think. Different. I've been doing a lot of thinking about us, about myself, about what went wrong in our marriage." "And what conclusions have you reached?" David was quiet for a moment, stirring his coffee with deliberate precision. "I've been talking to a therapist, Dr. Martinez, someone Michelle recommended. It's been helpful to have an outside perspective on everything that's happened." I was surprised and pleased by this development. "What has Dr. Martinez helped you understand?" "That my attitudes toward women in business weren't just casual, sexism, or generational differences. They were the result of deep-seated insecurities about my own worth and capabilities. I needed to feel superior to the women around me because I was afraid that if I acknowledged their competence, it would somehow diminish my own value." The insight was more sophisticated than I had expected, suggesting that David's therapy was progressing more quickly than mine. "I've also realized that I actively discouraged you from sharing your thoughts and expertise, even when you tried to contribute to conversations about business strategy. I wasn't just failing to recognize your capabilities. I was actively suppressing them because they made me uncomfortable." "What made you uncomfortable about them?" "The possibility that you might know more than I did about something. The threat to my role as the wise, experienced partner who could guide and educate you. The fear that if you were successful and knowledgeable, you might not need me anymore." David's honesty was both refreshing and painful. He was acknowledging patterns of behavior that had been destructive to our relationship, but he was also revealing the depth of his insecurity and need for superiority. "The thing is," he continued, "I do still love you. Not the version of you that I thought I was married to, but the real you. The brilliant, successful, strategic woman who built a company from nothing while pretending to struggle with household management. That person is fascinating and admirable, and I wish I had been mature enough to appreciate her 4 years ago." My heart constricted with a mixture of hope and sadness. "What are you saying, David?" "I'm saying that I want to try to rebuild our relationship, but only if we can do it authentically this time. No more pretending. No more managing each other's egos. No more carefully curated versions of ourselves. I want to be married to the real Jessica Martinez, and I want you to be married to the real David Chen, whoever that turns out to be." "And who is the real David Chen?" "I'm still figuring that out, but I know he's someone who's committed to examining his own biases and assumptions. Someone who wants to celebrate his partner's success rather than feeling threatened by it. Someone who's willing to be vulnerable and admit when he's wrong, instead of always needing to be the expert." The conversation continued for 2 hours, covering the practical and emotional aspects of potentially rebuilding our relationship. We talked about couples counseling, about living arrangements, about how to navigate the professional complications of being married to each other while working in the same organizational structure. By the time we parted ways in the parking lot, we had agreed to begin couples counseling with Dr. Blackwood while continuing our individual therapy. We would maintain separate living arrangements for the time being, taking time to rebuild trust and establish new patterns of communication. Most importantly, we would commit to complete honesty. even when that honesty was uncomfortable or challenging. As I drove home through the Phoenix evening, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months: cautious optimism. The road ahead would be difficult, requiring us both to fundamentally change how we related to each other and to ourselves. But for the first time since the revelation, I believed that we might be capable of building something genuine and sustainable from the wreckage of our previous relationship. The house no longer felt empty when I arrived. It felt like a space of possibility, a place where I could continue to live authentically while working toward a future that might include David, but only if we could both become the people capable of loving each other without pretense or performance. Whether we would succeed remained to be seen, but the journey toward authentic connection felt like the most important work either of us had ever undertaken. 3 months into couples therapy with Dr. Blackwood, David and I sat across from each other in her warmly lit office, no longer the adversaries we had been when this journey began, but not quite the partners we hoped to become. The space between us had changed from hostile territory to neutral ground, a place where difficult truths could be spoken without the fear of immediate retaliation or defensive walls going up. I'd like to explore what authentic partnership looks like for both of you, Dr. Blackwood said, settling into her chair with the calm presence that had guided us through some of our most challenging conversations. Jessica, you've spent considerable time understanding why you felt the need to hide your professional identity. David, you've been examining the attitudes and insecurities that made Jessica feel unsafe being her complete self with you. The question now is whether you can build something new together. David shifted in his chair, a gesture I'd learned to recognize as his way of gathering courage before saying something vulnerable. I've been thinking about what I actually want from a marriage, he began, his voice steadier than it had been in our early sessions. For years, I thought I wanted a wife who needed me, who looked up to me for guidance and wisdom. But working with Dr. Martinez has helped me understand that what I really want is a true partner, someone whose strength complements mine rather than someone whose perceived weakness makes me feel strong. The transformation in his language was remarkable. 3 months ago, David had spoken in defensive terms, focusing on what had been done to him rather than examining his own contributions to our problems. Now he was taking ownership of his desires and acknowledging how those desires had shaped our dysfunctional dynamic. And what does that look like practically? Dr. Blackwood asked. It looks like celebrating Jessica's professional achievements instead of feeling threatened by them. It looks like asking for her input on decisions because I value her judgment, not because I'm obligated to include her. It looks like being genuinely curious about her thoughts and perspectives instead of assuming I already know what she's going to say. I felt a flutter of something that might have been hope, though I'd learned to be cautious about optimism during this process. David had made similar statements before, only to fall back into old patterns when faced with real-world situations that challenged his ego. Jessica, how do you respond to what David is saying? Dr. Blackwood turned to me, her expression encouraging but neutral. It's what I want to hear, I said carefully, but I need to see it demonstrated consistently, not just articulated in therapy sessions. The gap between intellectual understanding and behavioral change is significant, and David has decades of conditioning to overcome. That's fair, David acknowledged immediately. I know that my word isn't enough anymore. I have to prove through my actions that I've genuinely changed, not just learned to say the right things. Dr. Blackwood nodded approvingly. Let's talk about what that proof might look like. What specific changes would you need to see, Jessica, to begin trusting that David has fundamentally shifted his approach to partnership? The question forced me to articulate expectations I'd been carrying but hadn't fully examined. I need to see him actively seeking my input on important decisions, both personal and professional. I need to see him supporting other women's advancement at work, not just paying lip service to equality. I need to see him react to challenges to his expertise or authority with curiosity rather than defensiveness. Those are concrete, observable behaviors, Dr. Blackwood noted. David, how do you feel about those expectations? They're reasonable, he said, though I could see the slight tension in his jaw that suggested they also felt daunting. But I also need something from Jessica. I need her to be patient with the learning process and to call me out directly when I'm falling into old patterns, rather than managing around my behavior or withdrawing into secrecy. The request was fair, but challenging. My default response to David's problematic behavior had always been avoidance or accommodation, rather than direct confrontation. The idea of consistently challenging him when he displayed sexist attitudes or dismissive behavior felt exhausting, but I recognized it was necessary for any authentic relationship between us. I can commit to that, I said, but I need you to receive that feedback without becoming defensive or turning it into an argument about my delivery or timing. Agreed. Dr. Blackwood smiled slightly, the first time I'd seen her show overt approval during our sessions. These are significant commitments you're making to each other. They represent a fundamental shift from managing each other's reactions to trusting each other with honest feedback. Are you both ready to test these commitments in the real world? The question hung in the air between us. For 3 months, we'd been meeting in this safe space, guided by professional expertise, protected from the full consequences of our words and actions. Moving back into daily life together would mean navigating these new dynamics without Dr. Blackwood's steady presence, relying on the skills we'd developed and the trust we'd begun to rebuild. I think so, I said slowly. But I'd like to maintain our individual therapy sessions and continue couples sessions monthly, at least initially. Absolutely, David agreed. This process has been too valuable to abandon just because we're ready to try living together again. 2 weeks later, David moved back into our Sunrise Hills home, carrying the same suitcase he'd packed with such angry precision 6 months earlier. But everything else about his return was different. We'd spent the intervening time establishing new routines and expectations, creating space for both his belongings and his authentic presence in rooms that had been solely mine for half a year. The most significant change was in my home office, which we'd transformed from my secret command center into a shared workspace that acknowledged both of our professional lives. David had contributed a large monitor and ergonomic desk chair, while I'd added a second workstation where he could handle his own projects and client communications. The jewelry-making supplies remained, but they occupied their honest place as a genuine hobby rather than an elaborate cover story. It feels different, David observed on his first morning back, standing in the doorway with his coffee and looking around the space that had once been off-limits to him. Good different, or unsettling different? Good different. More honest. Like we're finally sharing the same reality instead of living in parallel fictional worlds. The integration wasn't seamless. There were moments of friction as we negotiated new boundaries and expectations. David's first instinct was still to offer unsolicited advice about business decisions, catching himself mid-sentence and asking, instead, if I wanted his input. My first instinct was still to manage his emotions by withholding information that might make him uncomfortable, forcing myself to share updates about client meetings and strategic decisions, even when I could see his discomfort. But there were also moments of genuine connection that we'd never experienced during our original marriage. When I landed a major contract with a national retail chain, David's first response was unalloyed celebration, taking me out to dinner and boasting to the server about his wife's business acumen. When he presented an innovative digital strategy to Nova Strategics board and received enthusiastic approval, I felt proud of his accomplishments without any need to diminish them or protect my own ego. The professional dynamics at Pinnacle continued to evolve as well. Michelle Park had been promoted to Vice President of Human Resources, a role that gave her the authority to implement systemic changes rather than simply advocating for them. The workplace culture surveys showed continued improvement, with employee satisfaction scores reaching levels that exceeded industry benchmarks. David's work in the digital innovation department had flourished under the new organizational structure, Free from the interpersonal complications of his previous role, he'd been able to focus on strategic analysis and technological solutions, producing work that was both innovative and practical. Several clients had specifically requested his involvement in their digital transformation projects, rebuilding the professional reputation that had been damaged by the revelation of our complicated personal history. "I've been thinking about something," David said one evening as we prepared dinner together. A domestic collaboration that felt both familiar and entirely new. Michelle mentioned that there's an opening for a chief technology officer position at the new branch office in Denver. It would be a significant promotion, and it would remove any lingering concerns about nepotism or conflicts of interest. I paused in my chopping of vegetables, processing this unexpected development. "Are you interested in the position?" "I'm interested in the opportunity to prove myself in a leadership role where my relationship with you isn't a factor in how people perceive my capabilities. But I'm only interested if you think it could work for us personally." The conversation that followed stretched over several hours and multiple cups of coffee. We discussed the logistics of managing a long-distance relationship, the professional advantages of David establishing his independent success, and the emotional implications of voluntary separation after having worked so hard to rebuild our connection. "It would be temporary," David emphasized. 2 years to establish the Denver operation, build a strong team, and prove that I can succeed as an executive in my own right. Then I could transition back to Phoenix, or you could consider expanding Nova Strategic to Colorado." The more we talked, the more the opportunity seemed like a natural evolution of our new relationship dynamic. David would have the chance to build his leadership credentials without the complicated optics of working for his wife's company. I would have the space to continue growing Nova Strategic without constantly navigating the professional complications of our marriage. And we would both have the opportunity to test whether our rebuilt connection was strong enough to survive the challenges of distance and independent success. "I think you should take it," I said finally. "But I have some conditions." "I'm listening." "Complete transparency about your professional experiences in Denver. I want to hear about your challenges, your successes, your interactions with female colleagues and subordinates. I want to see evidence that the changes you've made are sustainable even when I'm not there to provide accountability." "Agreed. What else?" "Regular visits, both directions. I want us to remain actively involved in each other's lives, not drift into comfortable distance that lets us avoid the hard work of relationship maintenance." "Also agreed. Anything else?" I considered carefully before responding. "I want us to use this time to continue our individual growth work. You've made significant progress in examining your attitudes and assumptions, but there's more work to be done. I need to continue learning how to be vulnerable and trusting rather than managing and controlling." David moved to Denver 6 weeks later, on a crisp October morning when the desert mountains were touched with the first hints of autumn. I drove with him to the airport, both of us emotional but optimistic about this next phase of our relationship. 2 years feels like a long time," he said as we sat in the departure area, watching planes take off and land through the terminal windows. "It is a long time, but it's also an investment in our future. You'll come back to Phoenix as a proven executive with your own achievements and reputation. I'll have had time to grow Nova Strategic without worrying about how our relationship affects your professional standing. And if we discover that distance reveals problems we haven't addressed, then we'll address them honestly, with professional help if necessary. But if we discover that our connection is strong enough to survive independence and separation, we'll know we've built something real." The first few months of David's time in Denver exceeded both of our expectations. His weekly calls were filled with genuine enthusiasm about the challenges and opportunities of building a new operation from the ground up. He spoke with obvious pride about the diverse team he was assembling, making a point to highlight the women and underrepresented minorities he'd recruited for key positions. I hired Maria Santos as my deputy CTO, he told me during one of our video calls. She has an MIT PhD in computer science and 5 years of experience at Apple. In the past, I might have been intimidated by her credentials or worried that she'd make me look bad by comparison. Now, I'm just excited to work with someone so talented. The change in his perspective was remarkable and consistent. David sent me articles he'd read about workplace diversity, asked for my input on strategic decisions for the Denver office, and spoke with genuine admiration about female leaders in the technology industry. The intellectual understanding I developed in therapy was being reinforced and expanded through real-world experience. My own growth during this period was equally significant. Without David's physical presence, I was forced to examine my tendencies toward emotional management and control. Dr. Blackwood helped me recognize that my pattern of withholding information and managing others' reactions extended beyond my marriage. Into my professional relationships and friendships, you've spent so much energy trying to control how others perceive and react to you that you've lost touch with your own authentic responses to situations, she observed during one of our sessions. Learning to be vulnerable means accepting that you can't control how others respond to your honesty. The insight was uncomfortable but transformative. I began practicing greater openness with Angela, with my clients, and with the other relationships in my life. The results were sometimes challenging, but ultimately more satisfying than the careful emotional management I'd been practicing for years. 18 months into David's Denver assignment, Nova Strategic received an acquisition offer from a national consulting firm that would have tripled our valuation and provided significant expansion opportunities. In the past, I might have made the decision independently or sought David's input while already knowing what I wanted to do. Instead, I called him immediately and asked for his honest perspective on the opportunity. "It's a good offer," he said, after reviewing the documentation I'd sent. "But I don't think it aligns with your long-term vision for the company. You've always talked about maintaining the personal touch and customized approach that distinguishes Nova from larger firms. This acquisition would make that impossible." His analysis was perceptive and aligned with my own instincts, but I was surprised by how much his validation meant to me. "You don't think I'm being foolish to turn down this kind of financial opportunity?" "I think you're being true to your values and your vision. That's not foolish. It's admirable." I declined the acquisition offer and instead used the interest it had generated to negotiate better terms with existing clients and attract new ones. Within 6 months, Nova Strategic's revenue had increased by 40%, vindicating the KAI decision to remain independent. When David returned to Phoenix 2 years later, he came back as the successful CTO who had built a thriving operation and established his reputation as an innovative leader in his own right. More importantly, he returned as a man who had proven to himself and others that he could succeed without needing to diminish the women around him. We met at the same coffee shop in Old Town Scottsdale where we'd first discussed rebuilding our relationship, but the dynamic between us was entirely different. We were no longer two people trying to salvage something that had been broken, but two individuals who had grown independently and were choosing to build something new together. "I missed you," David said simply, reaching across the table to take my hand. "I missed you too. But I also needed the time apart to become the person who could be married to the person you've become." "And who is that person?" "Someone who trusts enough to be vulnerable, who's strong enough to be authentic, who loves herself enough to accept being loved honestly by someone else." David smiled, the genuine expression of joy that had become characteristic of our interactions over the past 2 years. "I'd like to be married to that person, if she'll have me." We were remarried 6 months later in a small ceremony attended by family and close friends who had witnessed both the destruction of our first marriage and the patient work of building something authentic from its ruins. Angela served as my maid of honor, and Michelle Park gave a reading about love that grows stronger through honesty rather than in spite of it. Patricia Chen, David's mother, spoke at the reception about the importance of second chances and the courage required to admit when fundamental changes are necessary. These two people chose to do the hard work of becoming worthy of each other, she said, raising her glass in a toast. That's not romantic in the traditional sense, but it's something much more valuable. It's real. As David and I danced to our new song, a piece we'd chosen together rather than inherited from our first wedding, I reflected on the journey that had brought us to this moment. The revelation at the Phoenix Convention Center had been the end of one story and the beginning of another. The first story had been about two people who fell in love with carefully curated versions of each other. The second story was about two people who chose to love each other's authentic selves, complete with flaws, growth edges, and the ongoing work of partnership. 5 years later, Nova Strategic has expanded to 3 cities, with David serving as our Chief Technology Officer and leading our digital innovation initiatives. Our professional collaboration is everything I had dreamed of during those lonely years of maintaining separate identities. Genuine partnership, mutual respect, shared vision, and the kind of creative tension that comes from two strong people challenging each other to excel. Our personal relationship continues to require conscious effort and regular maintenance. We still attend couples therapy quarterly, not because we're in crisis, but because we've learned that authentic connection requires ongoing attention and skill development. We've established traditions of radical honesty, including monthly check-ins, where we discuss what's working in our relationship and what needs attention. The house in Sunrise Hills has become a true home, filled with the authentic presence of two people who no longer need to perform for each other. My office remains a shared space where David and I often work side by side, comfortable in the knowledge that we're both contributing our genuine expertise to our individual and collective success. Sometimes I think about that evening at the award ceremony when David called me a simple housewife in front of Phoenix's business community. The woman he was describing never existed, but the journey to become the woman I am now required moving through that fiction and out the other side. The simple housewife was a character I played, but the CEO who bought his company was always who I really was, waiting for the courage and circumstances to step fully into my own power. David and I learned that authentic love requires seeing and accepting each other's complete selves, not managing or minimizing parts that make us uncomfortable. We learned that true partnership means celebrating each other's strengths, rather than feeling threatened by them. Most importantly, we learned that some relationships are worth fighting for, but only if both people are willing to become worthy of what they're fighting to save. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.